My name is Michael Mick Hargrove. I was a specialist in the 25th Infantry Division, Tropic Lightning, during the Vietnam War in 1969. I was just 20 years old when I stepped off that plane in Tan Son Hut, scared out of my mind and wondering what the hell I'd signed up for. My job was infantry, plain and simple, nothing fancy about it. My weapon was an M16 rifle, and I carried a few grenades in my pack along with some basic gear. I was young, green, and not entirely sure how I was going to survive my first day, let alone a whole tour. Our unit had been stationed near a small village in Tay Ninh province, not far from the Cambodian border. This was thick jungle country, where the air was so humid you felt like you were breathing soup, and the bugs were the size of house cats. The Viet Cong had been active in the area, using it as a supply route, and it was our job to patrol the trails and disrupt their movements. That's what they told us. Anyway, most days it felt like we were just bait, trudging through the jungle, waiting for an ambush. One of those days started just like any other. Our squad leader, Sergeant Donnelly, briefed us over a lukewarm can of sea rations. We were to sweep an area known as the Green Corridor, a narrow stretch of jungle infamous for ambushes. They said the VC knew it better than the back of their hand, and they weren't shy about letting us know. Claymore mines, snipers, and traps. If there was a way to kill you, they'd thought of it. But orders were orders, and we packed up and moved out just after sunrise. There were 6 of us that day. Sergeant Donnelly was in charge, a wiry guy from upstate New York who always had a cigarette hanging from his lips, even during firefights. Then there was Private Ramirez, our point man, who was fast as hell and sharp as a tack. Kowalski, the big guy from Chicago, carried the M60 machine gun. Doc Henderson, our medic, had this quiet way about him that made you trust him immediately. Finally, there was Jenkins, the F&G, that's F********ing new guy, who looked like he was about to puke every time he loaded his rifle. We moved single file, spaced about 10 feet apart, the way we'd been trained. Every sound was magnified. The crunch of boots on leaves, the buzz of insects, the distant call of some unseen bird. I remember gripping my M16, so tight my knuckles turned white. You could feel the tension in the air, like the jungle itself was watching us. About an hour into the patrol, Ramirez raised his fist to signal a halt. He crouched down, peering at something on the trail ahead. Sergeant Donnelly moved up beside him, and the rest of us fanned out, scanning the trees for movement. After a minute, Donnelly waved us forward. When I got up there, I saw what had stopped Ramirez, a tripwire stretched across the trail, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. It was rigged to a claymore mine, hidden in the undergrowth. Jenkins muttered a shaky, "Holy shit," and I couldn't blame him. If Ramirez hadn't spotted that wire, we'd all be in pieces by now. Donnelly carefully disarmed the trap, his hands steady like a surgeon's. "Welcome to Vietnam," he said with a grim smile, tossing the claymore into the bushes. We pressed on, even more cautious now. The jungle seemed to close in around us, the trees and vines forming a suffocating wall. My heart was pounding, and every shadow looked like a VC waiting to spring. The minutes dragged on like hours until we finally reached a small clearing. Donnelly called a halt, and we set up a perimeter to take a break. I was sitting there, wiping the sweat from my face, when Kowalski nudged me. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the tree line. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I caught it, a glint of metal, just for a split second. "Gun?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Could be binoculars," he replied. Donnelly didn't waste time. He motioned for us to spread out, taking cover behind trees and logs. "Stay sharp," he hissed. "If they're watching us, they're probably calling in reinforcements." We sat there in silence, every muscle in my body tense as a bowstring. I kept my eyes glued to the tree line where Kowalski had seen the glint of metal. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours, but nothing moved. The jungle was eerily quiet now, as if it knew something was about to happen. Donnelly motioned for Ramirez to move up and scout ahead. Ramirez nodded and slipped into the undergrowth like a ghost. I don't know how he did it, but the guy could move through the jungle without making a sound. The rest of us stayed put, covering his advance. My finger hovered over the trigger of my M16, sweat trickling down my back. A few minutes later, Ramirez returned, crouching low. "It's a listening post," he whispered. 3, maybe 4 VC, just sitting there. "Looks like they've got radios, but they haven't seen us yet." Donnelly nodded, his mind already working through the options. We couldn't just bypass them. Not with a chance they'd call in a larger force. But a full-on assault would be risky. The VC had a way of turning ambushes into nightmares, and the last thing we wanted was to stumble into a trap. "We'll hit him fast and quiet," Donnelly said. "Ramirez, take point again. Kowalski, you're back up with the pig. The rest of you cover our 6. We move on my signal." The plan was simple enough, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. I swallowed hard and checked my gear. My hands were shaking as I double-checked my rifle and grenades. Beside me, Jenkins looked like he was about to faint. I gave him a nod, trying to reassure him, though I didn't feel too reassured myself. We moved out, creeping through the undergrowth toward the enemy position. The jungle seemed even thicker here, every step a careful negotiation to avoid snapping a twig or rustling the foliage. I could feel the tension building with every step, like the air itself was pressing down on us. Finally, we saw them. 4 VC, sitting in a small clearing, their AK-47s resting against a tree. One of them was hunched over a radio, speaking in low tones, while the others kept a lazy watch on the jungle around them. They looked relaxed, like they weren't expecting trouble. Donnelly gave the signal, a quick hand motion, and all hell broke loose. Ramirez fired the first shot, dropping the guy on the radio before he could even react. Kowalski let loose with the M60, the deep, thunderous roar cutting through the stillness. I opened up with my M16, aiming at the closest target and squeezing the trigger in short bursts like they taught us in training. The VC didn't stand a chance. 2 of them went down instantly, and the other 2 tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Within seconds, it was over. The clearing was silent again, except for the ringing in my ears and the distant echo of gunfire fading into the jungle. We moved quickly, searching the bodies and the makeshift camp. The radio was intact, which was a big win for us. Donnelly called it in, relaying our position and the situation back to HQ. Meanwhile, Doc Henderson checked the bodies for anything useful, maps, documents, anything that could give us an edge. While we were searching, Ramirez froze, his head snapping up. "We got company," he hissed. I turned, following his gaze, and my stomach dropped. Through the trees, I could see them, more VC, at least a dozen, moving toward us in a loose formation. They must have heard the gunfire and come to investigate. "Ambush," Donnelly barked. "Take cover and hold your fire until I give the order." We scrambled for cover, diving behind trees and logs, our hearts pounding. I could hear them now, the rustle of leaves and the faint murmur of voices. They were close, too close. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped my rifle, my breathing fast and shallow. The VC moved into the clearing, their rifles at the ready, scanning the area for signs of us. They didn't see us at first, their attention focused on the bodies of their fallen comrades. Then Jenkins panicked. He fired too soon, his shot going wide and hitting a tree. The VC whipped around, shouting in their language, and all hell broke loose again. When Jenkins fired, it was like a switch flipped, and suddenly the jungle exploded with chaos. The VC dove for cover, shouting orders and returning fire. Bullets tore through the foliage, snapping branches and kicking up dirt around us. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire, the sharp cracks of AK-47s mingling with the deeper thuds of our M16S and the relentless hammering of Kowalski's M60. I pressed myself against the ground behind a fallen log, trying to make myself as small a target as possible. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands felt numb as I clutched my rifle. I fired in short bursts, aiming at the flashes of movement in the trees. I couldn't tell if I was hitting anything. I just kept shooting, hoping to keep their heads down. "Jenkins, get down!" Donnelly shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. But Jenkins was frozen in the open, his rifle shaking in his hands. He was firing wildly, his shots going everywhere but where they needed to. A VC spotted him and raised his rifle. Time seemed to slow down as I watched in horror. Then Ramirez popped up from his position, his rifle cracking twice. The VC dropped like a sack of potatoes, and Ramirez shouted, "Move, Jenkins! Now!" Jenkins finally snapped out of it and scrambled back to cover, his face pale and his chest heaving. Donnelly gave him a hard look, but didn't say anything. There wasn't time. The VC were pushing hard, trying to flank us. I could see them darting through the trees, their movements quick and practiced. They knew this terrain better than we ever could. Kowalski was doing his best to keep them pinned with the M60, but even he couldn't cover every angle. "Grenades!" Donnelly yelled. I reached for one of the M26s strapped to my gear, pulling the pin with trembling fingers. I counted to 2, just like they taught us, and lobbed it toward the cluster of trees where I'd seen movement. The explosion was deafening, and I saw bodies fly through the air. Ramirez threw one next, and then Kowalski, each grenade tearing through the jungle with a brutal efficiency. The VC fire slackened for a moment, giving us a brief reprieve. "Fall back to the ridge," Donnelly ordered. "We can't hold here." We scrambled to our feet, firing as we moved, try to keep the enemy at bay. The ridge wasn't far, maybe 50 yards, but it felt like miles. My legs burned, and my lungs screamed for air as I ran, the weight of my gear making every step a struggle. We reached the ridge and threw ourselves down behind the natural cover it provided. From here, we had a better vantage point, and Donnelly quickly set up a defensive line. Kowalski propped up the M60 on a rock, his face grim as he fed the belt into the weapon. Ramirez and I took up positions on either side, while Jenkins and Doc Henderson stayed low in the center. The VC came at us hard, their shouts echoing through the jungle. I could see them moving through the trees, their dark uniforms blending into the shadows. They were relentless, pressing forward even as we cut them down. Kowalski's M60 roared to life, the steady stream of fire cutting through the advancing enemy. I added my own fire to the mix, aiming for anything that moved. My arms ached, and my shoulders throbbed from the recoil, but I didn't stop. "Doc, we need smoke," Donnelly called. Doc Henderson pulled a couple of smoke grenades from his pack, popping the pins and tossing them over the ridge. Thick, white clouds billowed up, obscuring our position and buying us a little time. As the smoke spread, Donnelly leaned over to me and Ramirez. "We need to call in air support. Ramirez, you're with me. The rest of you, hold the line." Ramirez nodded, and the two of them crawled back through the underbrush, heading for a spot where they could use the radio without drawing fire. That left me, Kowalski, Jenkins, and Doc to hold off the VC. The smoke was a double-edged sword. It gave us cover, but it also made it harder to see the enemy. I fired blindly into the haze, hoping to keep the VC from getting too close. Then I heard it, the distinct clink of a grenade hitting the ground. "Grenade!" I shouted, diving to the side. The explosion rocked the ridge, sending dirt and debris flying. My ears rang, and my vision blurred for a moment. When I came to, I saw Jenkins lying a few feet away, clutching his leg. Blood seeped through his fingers, and his face was twisted in pain. "Doc!" I called, crawling over to Jenkins. Doc Henderson was already on it, pulling Jenkins behind cover and working quickly to stop the bleeding. Kowalski kept firing, his jaw set in a determined grimace. "We're going to get through this," I said to Jenkins, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. A few minutes later, I heard the roar of engines overhead. Donnelly and Ramirez had done it. They called in air support. "Get down!" Donnelly shouted as he and Ramirez rejoined us. The first strike hit like thunder, the jungle erupting in fire and shrapnel. Napalm lit up the tree line, and the VC scattered, their screams lost in the deafening roar. Helicopters swooped in, their door gunners unleashing a relentless barrage. The fight wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned. The sound of the helicopters was deafening, a mix of the rotor blades chopping the air and the heavy thump of machine gun fire. As the choppers swooped in, their gunners rained hell on the VC positions. The jungle erupted in chaos. Trees splintered, dirt and debris filled the air, and the ground shook beneath us. It was like watching the hand of God tear through the jungle, but we weren't safe yet. The VC were tough, and they didn't go down easy. Even as the napalm burned and the gunships strafed their lines, they kept fighting, taking shots at the choppers and us whenever they had the chance. "Hold your positions," Donnelly shouted over the roar of the air support. He was crawling along the ridge, checking on each of us. His face was smudged with dirt, and his voice was hoarse, but he kept us together. Jenkins was still pale, his leg hastily bandaged by document. "I can't move," he muttered, his voice shaky. "You don't need to move," Doc said firmly. "Just stay low and keep pressure on the wound." I kept firing in bursts, my rifle feeling heavier with every shot. My arms were like lead, and my eyes stung from the sweat and smoke. Next to me, Kowalski's M60 chattered relentlessly, the barrel glowing red-hot. "Out of belts!" Kowalski shouted, tossing the empty ammo box aside. "I got one!" Ramirez yelled, sliding a fresh belt toward him. Kowalski reloaded in record time, his big hands working with practiced efficiency. As soon as the M60 was ready, he opened up again, laying down a wall of suppressive fire. The helicopters made another pass, their door gunners shredding what was left of the VC's positions. I saw a few of the enemy retreating, disappearing into the jungle. A small, desperate part of me wanted to believe it was over, but I knew better. Donnelly crouched beside me, shouting to be heard over the chaos. "We got maybe 10 minutes before they regroup. We need to pull back and rendezvous with Bravo Company." "Where's Bravo?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the noise. "About a click east," Donnelly replied. "We can't stay here. We're too exposed." "Copy that," I said, my throat dry. Donnelly signaled for the squad to prepare to move. Jenkins would have to be carried, and Kowalski volunteered immediately. "I'll take him," he said, slinging the M60 over his shoulder and moving to lift Jenkins onto his back. "Let me help," Doc said, grabbing Jenkins' gear to lighten the load. As we prepared to move, the gunfire died down, and the helicopters began to circle. It was a brief moment of relative calm, but it only made me more nervous. The jungle was never quiet unless something bad was about to happen. We started moving east, staying low and sticking to the thickest cover we could find. Donnelly led the way, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain for traps or movement. Ramirez was close behind him, his rifle at the ready. I brought up the rear, my heart pounding with every step. The jungle seemed alive with tension. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, felt like a warning. The heat was oppressive, and the smell of smoke and burnt vegetation clung to the air. We hadn't gone more than 300 yards when Ramirez stopped suddenly, holding up a fist. We all froze, listening. There was a faint rustling sound coming from the trees to our left. It was too steady to be an animal. Donnelly signaled for us to spread out and take cover. I found a thick tree and crouched behind it, my rifle trained on the sound. My pulse was racing, my finger hovering over the trigger. The rustling grew louder, and then I saw them, 2 VC scouts, moving cautiously through the underbrush. They were checking the area, probably looking for survivors from their unit. Donnelly held up a hand, signaling us to hold fire. We stayed perfectly still, watching as the scouts moved closer. They were about 20 feet away now, their AK-47s held at the ready. Then one of them spotted something, a faint boot print in the dirt. He crouched down, inspecting it, while the other kept watch. I held my breath, my hands trembling. If they found us, we were dead. Before they could react, Ramirez fired. His shot was perfect, dropping the first scout instantly. The second scout turned, raising his rifle, but Donnelly took him out with a single, precise shot. "Move!" Donnelly hissed, waving us forward. We picked up the pace, pushing through the jungle as fast as we could without losing our bearings. The sound of distant shouting told us the rest of the VC weren't far behind. Finally, we broke through the trees and onto a narrow trail. Donnelly checked his map, his brow furrowed. "Bravo should be just ahead," he said. We followed the trail, every step feeling like an eternity. Then, through the trees, we saw them, Bravo Company, set up in a defensive position on a small hill. "We got friendlies," Donnelly called out, raising his hands. The guys from Bravo waved us in, and we scrambled up the hill, collapsing behind their lines. "You look like hell," their CO said, his tone half-joking. "You should see the other guys," Donnelly replied, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. We barely had time to catch our breath before the hill erupted into chaos. Bravo Company had set up a solid defensive position, sandbags, foxholes, and a handful of machine gun nests, but the VC weren't going to let us sit there unchallenged. "They're regrouping." "Bravo, CO," Captain Mathers shouted. He was a tall, wiry guy with a no-nonsense attitude. "Get your men into position, Sergeant Donnelly. We're going to need every trigger we've got." Donnelly nodded, quickly organizing our battered squad. Kowalski set up his M60 in a foxhole alongside one of Bravo's gunners, while Ramirez and I took positions in the tree line just below the hill. Doc stayed with Jenkins, who was propped up against a sandbag wall, his leg bound tightly in a makeshift split. I scanned the jungle through the sights of my M16, my heart pounding. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Somewhere out there, the VC were preparing to hit us again. The first shots came just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. A single crack echoed through the trees, followed by a barrage of gunfire. Bullets snapped through the air, tearing into the trees and dirt around us. "Contact front," someone shouted. I ducked behind a fallen log, returning fire in short, controlled bursts. The muzzle flashes from the enemy rifles were like fireflies in the growing darkness, giving us a rough idea of their positions. "They're trying to flank us," Ramirez yelled. Sure enough, I saw movement on our left, shadows darting between the trees. I swung my rifle around, firing at anything that moved. The VC were like ghosts, blending into the jungle so well that they seemed to disappear the moment you saw them. "Grenades!" Captain Mathers barked. A couple of guys from Bravo tossed frags into the tree line, the explosions lighting up the jungle like fireworks. For a moment, the gunfire slowed, but it didn't stop. The VC were relentless, their shouts growing louder as they pressed the attack. I felt a sharp sting in my arm and looked down to see blood soaking through my sleeve. A bullet had grazed me, but there was no time to worry about it. I gritted my teeth and kept firing, the recoil of my rifle rattling my already frayed nerves. Kowalski's M60 was a lifesaver, laying down a wall of fire that kept the enemy from overrunning our position. He was a machine, his big frame barely flinching as he fed belt after belt into the gun. "Keep it coming, you bastards," he roared, his voice hoarse but defiant. The fighting raged on, the jungle coming alive with the sounds of battle. The smell of gunpowder and burning vegetation filled the air, mingling with the acrid stench of sweat and blood. Then came the mortars. The first round landed just outside our perimeter, sending a geyser of dirt and shrapnel into the air. The second hit closer, shaking the ground beneath us. "Get down!" Donnelly shouted, diving into a foxhole. I flattened myself against the dirt, covering my head as more mortar rounds rained down. The explosions were deafening, each one a gut punch that left my ears ringing and my chest tight. When the barrage finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise. I lifted my head, coughing on the dust and smoke that hung in the air. "Everyone still alive?" Donnelly called out, his voice strained. "I'm good," Ramirez shouted, his face streaked with grime. "Same here," I said, though my whole body felt like one big bruise. Doc Henderson emerged from behind the sandbags, checking on Jenkins, who looked pale but conscious. "He's stable," Doc said, "but we're running out of time. He needs real medical attention." Captain Mathers nodded grimly. "We've got a medevac inbound, but they won't land until we clear the area." The gunfire picked up again, the VC pressing harder now. They must have known reinforcements were coming and wanted to finish us off before the choppers arrived. "We've got movement on the right," Ramirez called out. I swung my rifle around, spotting a group of VC trying to sneak up the hill. I opened fire, my rounds kicking up dirt around their feet. One of them went down, but the others kept coming, their AK-47 spitting bullets in our direction. Kowalski shifted his fire, the M60 roaring to life again. The VC scattered, but not before one of them lobbed a grenade in our direction. "Grenade!" I yelled, diving for cover. The explosion was deafening, sending dirt and shrapnel flying. I felt a sharp pain in my leg and looked down to see a piece of metal embedded just below my knee. It wasn't deep, but it hurt like hell. "You okay?" Ramirez shouted, crawling over to me. "I'll live," I said through gritted teeth. "Hang in there," he said, slapping me on the shoulder before crawling back to his position. The sound of rotor blades filled the air, and I looked up to see the medevac chopper coming in. Its spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the battlefield below. "They're here," Captain Mathers shouted. "Hold the line." The chopper hovered above the hill, its crew laying down suppressive fire with their door-mounted M60s. The VC scattered, retreating back into the jungle under the withering fire. "Let's move," Donnelly shouted, signaling for us to get Jenkins to the medevac. Kowalski and Doc lifted Jenkins between them, carrying him to the chopper as bullets zipped past. I limped behind them, my leg throbbing with every step. The medevac crew pulled Jenkins aboard, quickly assessing his condition. "We've got him," one of them shouted. "Let's go." The chopper lifted off, its powerful spotlight sweeping over the jungle one last time. We fell back to the defensive line, waiting for the inevitable counterattack. But it didn't come. The VC had retreated, leaving the battlefield eerily quiet. Donnelly slumped against a tree, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. "Hell of a night," he muttered. "Yeah," I said, sitting down beside him. My whole body felt like it had been run over by a truck, but I was alive. For now, that was enough. The quiet after the fight was almost unbearable. The jungle, which had been alive with the sounds of gunfire, shouting, and explosions, now felt suffocatingly silent. We sat in the dirt, too drained to speak, our ears still ringing from the chaos. The only sounds were the distant whir of the medevac chopper disappearing into the horizon and the occasional rustle of the leaves in the night breeze. "Think they're gone for good?" Ramirez finally asked, his voice breaking the uneasy stillness. "No," Donnelly said, exhaling a plume of smoke. His cigarette glowed like a tiny beacon in the darkness. "They'll be back. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll be back." I wanted to argue, to hope he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he was right. The VC didn't quit. They didn't have the luxury of giving up. This was their home, and they'd fight tooth and nail for it. Captain Mathers walked over, his face grim. "Command wants us to hold this position until morning. After that, we'll regroup with Charlie Company and figure out our next move." "Got it, sir," Donnelly replied. The captain nodded and moved on to check on the rest of his men. I shifted against the tree I was leaning on, wincing as the pain in my leg flared up. Doc had done his best to patch me up, but the shrapnel wounds still burned like hell. "You all right, Carter?" Donnelly asked, glancing at me. "Yeah, elite. Just peachy." He gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Get some rest if you can. We'll take turns on watch." I nodded and closed my eyes, though sleep was the last thing on my mind. Every time I blinked, I saw flashes of the fight, the muzzle flashes, the explosions, the bodies falling in the dirt. Jenkins' pale face as he bled out. The look of determination on Kowalski's face as he carried Jenkins to the chopper. The VC scout staring right at me before Ramirez dropped him. I opened my eyes again, staring up at the canopy of trees. The stars were faint, just barely visible through the gaps in the leaves. It was hard to believe that the same stars were shining down on folks back home, going about their lives like nothing was wrong. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came too soon. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the jungle, casting long shadows across the ground. It was a strange, almost serene sight, completely at odds with the destruction around us. We spent the morning fortifying the hill, setting up more sandbags and clearing fields of fire. Bravo's guys had a few claymores left, and they set those up along the most likely approaches. Donnelly kept us busy, giving us little time to dwell on what had happened the night before. By midday, the jungle was alive again, not with gunfire, but with the usual sounds of birds and insects. It was almost like nature was trying to cover up the scars of the battle. Almost. The medevac radioed in to let us know Jenkins had made it to the field hospital. He'd lost a lot of blood, but he was stable. That was the best news we'd had in days. Jenkins is tough, Kowalski said, a rare grin on his face. He'll pull through. We all needed that bit of hope. A few days later, we were pulled off the line and sent back to the rear for some much-needed R&R. It felt surreal stepping out of the jungle and into a world that was for the most part normal. The base camp was bustling with activity. Guys loading and unloading supplies, mechanics working on vehicles, medics tending to the wounded. The first thing I did was take a shower. The water was lukewarm at best, but it felt like heaven. I scrubbed away the layers of dirt, sweat, and blood, letting the water wash over me. After that, I hit the chow hall. The food wasn't great, powdered eggs and rubbery bacon, but it was better than the rations we'd been living on. As I ate, I couldn't help but think about the guys we'd lost. I didn't know all their names, but their faces were burned into my memory. And then there were the VC, the ones we'd killed. They weren't faceless enemies. They were people, just like us, fighting for what they believed in. It was a hard thing to wrap my head around. That night, we sat around a makeshift fire, sharing smokes and stories. Kowalski was in his element, regaling us with tales of his pre-war days. Ramirez chimed in with his own stories, most of which involved him getting into trouble back home. Donnelly sat a little apart from the rest of us, staring into the flames. I wondered what he was thinking about, but I didn't ask. Some things were better left unsaid. At some point, Kowalski handed me a can of warm beer. "To Jenkins," he said, raising his own can. "To Jenkins," I echoed, clinking my can against his. We all drank, the beer going down easier than it had any right to. That was one of the last missions we went on as a squad. Not long after that, Donnelly got orders to rotate back to the States. He didn't say much about it, just packed his gear and shook our hands before he left. "Take care of yourselves," he said, his voice low. "And don't do anything stupid." We all laughed, but it felt hollow. Kowalski got reassigned to another unit, and Ramirez ended up in a different sector. We promised to keep in touch, but we all knew how those promises usually went. By the time my tour was up, most of the guys I'd served with were either back home, reassigned, or gone. Now, sitting here all these years later, it's hard to believe it all really happened. The jungle, the fights, the people, it feels like another lifetime. But every now and then, I close my eyes, and I'm back there. I can still hear the gunfire, feel the heat of the napalm, smell the smoke. I remember Jenkins' face as we loaded him onto the chopper. I remember Donnelly's steady voice, keeping us together when everything was falling apart. I remember Kowalski's laugh, Ramirez's smirk, and the way the jungle came alive with fire and fury. I don't know if what we did made a difference. I like to think it did in some small way. But I do know this. We did our best. We fought for each other, for the guy next to us. And in a place like that, sometimes that's all you can do.